Iron Overload Hardcore episode 26 coming your way. Steve and Da Mobster joining me. How's it going, buddy?
We're ready to rock and roll. Let's go.
Today we're going to talk about oral trenbolone once again, but this time we're going to stack it with Clenbuterol. So this is going to be a little interesting, a little of a harsh stack, and this is going to be a pre-contest stack. So this is one that you would take, ahead of your contest. Look, I mean, ahead of a contest, guys will want to obviously trim up. The thing today, I think back in the 70s and 80s, especially the early 80s, guys back then, they didn't have as much of the mentality as this because they stayed much leaner. They were much smaller guys. Today, guys try to get as big as they can, put on as much muscle mass, and then they try to cut into pre-contest. That's pretty much the strategy for, I'd say, not at least 95% of people out there. So in this situation, you're going to be using two compounds that have cutting abilities and shredding abilities. So that's pretty much the idea here. And this is why guys tend to do that. We get a lot of food in our diet. We just had Thanksgiving. We're celebrating this the day after Thanksgiving in the United States. But for most of you listening, every day is Thanksgiving. I mean, if I open your refrigerator, it's full of food. If I open your pantry, it's full of food. Bodybuilders get plenty of food. So ahead of a contest, they want to cut down, lose fat, dry out, increase muscularity, all that good stuff. That's kind of the purpose. So Mobster, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on pre-contest, and then we're going to talk about each of these compounds, tell you about them, tell you how to stack them, and all that fun stuff. This is going to be one that you could try whether you're competing or not, just to try and see if you can shred down and get the most shreddiest physique you've ever had in your life. So.
Yeah, you know what's interesting for me, Steve, is that the old bulking thing really shouldn't happen the way that you suggest it, but it still does. So Steve talks about, I think he's mentioned on the forums a few times, the idea of what we call perma-bulkers. And because I'm a weightlifter, I'm probably in that category myself. Certainly not as lean as when I was 15 when I started. But it's that much harder to get into shape. So because of that, you end up using two drugs, which both have well-known side effects, which we'll get into, in order to help chisel off the surplus that really you ought not to be carrying. Now, if you're a professional athlete, especially as Steve says, for getting into shape for a competition, diet should be always number one, and then you shouldn't get that far out of shape. But that said, a little bit of fat, 10%, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15% is fine, and actually in its own little way is slightly anabolic in terms of freeing up the protein, etc., in your diet to allow you to grow your muscles, recover from workouts, and so on and so forth. Something else which occurred to me, Steve, looking at the article for Clen, and I know that this applies for Tren, is that both drugs are fed to cattle as a means of getting lean mass added to the cattle. In other words, more muscle equals more beef in the case of cattle to go to market with. So you've got there's less fat visible on the cows, on the bulls, etc., when they're ready to go to market. So yeah, both these two drugs have come from that industry. A lot of the steroids and the PEDs that we discussed come from medicine, from clinical use on human beings. But these two specifically have both come from especially the cattle industry. So that's fascinating for me on that regards as well, Steve. How do you?
So let's first get into Clenbuterol a little bit. So Clenbuterol is not an anabolic steroid. I think a lot of people get that confused. Because it's pushed a lot in steroid cycles. You'll see a steroid cycle for cutting, and you'll see Clenbuterol included. So everyone's like, oh yeah, it's a steroid. It's not. It's a drug. All right. It's basically the drug stimulates beta-2 receptors. It's a beta-2 agonist. So you're able to burn stored calories as your body fat, as energy before you reach other sources of fuel. So this is pretty much the reason why in bodybuilding circles, bodybuilders use it for fat loss. Now you see in Europe, it's approved as an asthma drug, but they use a much different dosage, obviously. It was never, the US FDA never approved it for that purpose here. So, but they do use it in livestock farming all over the world. They give it to animals to increase fat-free lean mass, so the animals get more muscles and less fat. It's pretty inhumane in my view. But this is the state of our food industry, you know. If you've ever eaten like a bird, you know, that you've gone and hunted for, or fish that you went and fished for, you can tell the difference in the taste. And if you've ever traveled around the world to like third world countries, you can taste the difference in that meat, and that's why. So you got to remember, factory farms in the U.S. are you know, a big thing. So they want to use these chemicals, and they also use Tren in the cattle industry as well. So that's the state of our food industry here. That's why we keep getting more sick. But that's a story for another podcast. But this just shows you that, you know, the fact that they're giving this stuff to animals, this stuff does work. But in bodybuilding circles, for a 250-pound bodybuilder to get any use out of this, you're going to have to jack up the dose. So that's the key. So primarily, look, it's used for fat loss. And a lot of guys react incredibly well to clenbuterol. You can remember Zizzy. He used to love clenbuterol. He actually passed away from, you know, he had like a heart attack, and he had other stuff wrong with him too, but he just fucking dropped dead, I think, in a sauna because he got so dehydrated. So this guy, he was using Clen, he was using oral Tren, he was using a lot of these harsh compounds. He abused the shit out of his body. So we're going to get into it later on the side effects. And this is something that's really something that, if you're like an obese person, you shouldn't go near this stuff. All right. If you are obese and you already have heart problems, clenbuterol is not the thing to do. So you want to be careful because it does come with side effects. So we're going to get into the dosing on how to properly dose clenbuterol. But I know Mobster, he has a lot to talk about this. You remember the Zizzy story, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with that with regards, because it came up on the forums recently, and I'd kind of seen a couple of photographs of him, but it's one of those on the edge of my radar. Then I heard, super young, and probably just pushing, as we know, in order for those Instagram, in order to get the likes, in order to keep that look 24/7 free. Yeah, so I was with Zizzy. He was on my radar, and I think it's one of those silly situations where, in order to get traction on YouTube and Instagram and social media, you kind of got to be doing silly things, whether that's goofing around on the camera or, in Zizzy's case, taking drugs and doing extreme things in order to keep the look 24/7, 365. Which is, to be honest, Steve, as you know from dealing with clients and competing athletes, you cannot keep that kind of look long term. It's a temporary condition, and Zizzy wasn't doing that. He was doing other stuff. And I think there's also an element, obviously, once you get into that kind of pattern of behavior, you're kind of going to be doing that stuff all the time. And here's the ridiculous thing: whether it's Zizzy or someone else, it is no age to die, and you're doing crazy things at way too young, way too soon, and just kind of ignoring the risk. So yeah, all in all, a sad and silly situation. Yeah, back to you.
So with clenbuterol, let's go over some of the overall side effects before we get into doses. So if you start experiencing these side effects, you may want to back off the dosage. So dizziness is a big one. Heart palpitation, anything with your heart, you need to take that seriously. Okay. I mean, I just don't understand why people, I do understand, because when you're younger, you think you're invincible. And in a lot of ways you are. You can do a lot of dumb shit when you're young. But as you get older, you know, your heart really takes a beating. Remember the way we evolved. Our ancestors used to live very, very short amounts of time. So if you want to have a lifelong, healthy life, you've got to do a better job taking care of your heart. Anxiety is a big one. Talked about on the pre-show. If you're pre-existing anxiety, you're going to have anxiety on this. Abnormal sweating. Overheating is a big one. I get overheated very easy. Live in a hot climate. I do a lot of outdoor stuff. Doesn't take long. If you're outside in the hot sun and the sun's beating on you, it doesn't take long for you to get into trouble, especially on Clen. blood pressure problems, heart problems overall. One of the other things that you look for is shake, like my hand. When I would take Clen, my hands would shake during the day. So that's what it does. If you want to get results from it, you almost have to have some of these side effects, but you want to also be able to manage them. So we'll get into the dosing very, very shortly when we talk about how to stack these compounds. But Mobster, he wants to jump in. So why don't you tell us a little bit more?
If you have any anxiety, pre-existing anxiety type issues, if you have any kind of response or reaction to stressful situations, you are with Clen, Steve, as you know, taking a drug that mimics those senses and those feelings. So what you're basically doing here, guys, is doubling down. You're going from, I already stress and get aggravated over things, and I'm taking a drug that makes me feel stressed and aggravated. It makes me feel kind of on edge and whatever. So those people really want to mitigate that as much as possible with regards to lowering the dose as much as possible, or realize that there are other options and that maybe for them, Clen is a bad idea. For the rest of you that have normal levels of anxiety or no, low levels of anxiety, knowing that this is how you're going to feel via these podcasts, via articles, having an awareness that the reason why you feel is not because you're stressed, not because you're aggravated, but it is the drug, it's doing its job. And of course, we've talked about this before, the stronger, harsher drugs do seem to force a reaction in terms of anabolism, fat burning, and so on. And having that awareness, basically, some people take this view, Steve, as you know, I can feel it working. And that's kind of that's the vibe you need to have it go for, Steve. That's the way you need to think. So instead of thinking, oh God, I feel stressed, no, this is the drug working. This is it doing its magic. This is stripping the fat away. And if you have that thought process, you can hold on to it when you're feeling kind of a little bit aggravation or stressed or whatever, then you'll get through it. And again, we're going to talk about dosing protocols to help you manage that anyway, Steve. Back to you.
Just get into oral trenbolone before we get into dosing so we can understand the differences. Now, oral trenbolone is not the same as injectable. Oral trenbolone, the dosing is completely different. Oral trenbolone, it's one of those compounds that you want to basically take, and you're going to have to take it obviously on a daily basis. It's got a much shorter half-life than the injectable version, even the acetate version. I mean, acetate, you just have to inject every other day or every 2.5 days. You're fine. With this one, you want to, take it daily. And a lot of guys, they'll run oral trenbolone for just 2 weeks and they'll have a huge improvement in their strength and their size. So I mean, this is going to be an interesting setup with how to do this. You can do something interesting with this setup, Mobster. And with oral trenbolone, it's one of the most strongest oral steroids that you can use. You definitely don't want to run it for a long period of time for that reason. And some of the side effects are right up the alley when it comes to Clenbuterol as well. You can experience some major androgenic, anabolic side effects with it, but you're not going to experience any estrogenic side effects. So that's why we use it here. And that's why, so when you take oral trenbolone, what can you expect? Hardening of your muscles, more vascularity, you'll be able to cut on it. And it works almost better for cutting than the injectable trenbolone. And I'll tell you why. I think one of the reasons for that is because with injectable trenbolone, you really have to consume carbs while you're on it, because that injectable trenbolone is really going to mess around with your blood sugar levels. So you're going to crave carbs when you're on the injectable trenbolone. But the oral trenbolone, that's not the case. The structure is different with it. You're not going to. It's got a short half-life. It's in your system, and for a shorter amount of time. So it's not building up in your system the way trenbolone enanthate would or trenbolone acetate would, where it would build up, and then hit a peak level. With oral trenbolone, it's got a sharper peak. So it's going in your system, spikes, the hormone spikes in your body. Then your next dosage, by the time you take your next dosage, the hormone is much lower in your body. So you kind of get like a sharper roller coaster of effects. versus with the injectable Trenbolone, where you get more of a stable effect, where you're going to have to carb load on it to kind of cut down on the side effects. Now, guys who want to do low carb diets on Tren, you'll hear stories about they felt miserable on it, they were fatigued, they can't sleep on it, Trensomnia, the Tren sweats, all that stuff can be helped by just spreading your carbs. But with the oral Trenbolone, if you're a low carb person or you follow keto or something like that, you can actually do that better when it comes to oral Tren. So oral Tren might be, for a lot of you, a much better choice than the injectable version when it comes to cutting. And this is why oral Tren is a great pre-contest. What I tell my clients with the injectable Tren, Mobster, is I tell them if you run the injectable Tren, which is a really good one to use, I tell them to stop it. You stop the injectable Tren ahead of the contest, because what happens is the injectable Tren is so damn inflammatory in the body that you look your best a couple weeks after you stop Tren than you do while you're actually on Tren. Does that make sense? Have you guys noticed that, who ran Tren out there? Why don't you comment on that and tell me how right I am about that? You look better 2-3 weeks after you stop the Tren versus when you're actually on the Tren itself, and you feel a lot better too, so you're able to actually look better. So this is why I tell a lot of my clients I work with to stop the Tren ahead of time. But with the oral Tren, you don't have to do that. The oral Tren, you can keep using it until the day of the contest, and it's not going to cause that as much inflammation on your body, where it's going to cause that more fluffier look with Tren, but it's going to cause actually more vascularity, more hardness. So it's exactly what you want going into your contest. So that's really the difference between the oral and the injectable. So Mobster, jump in on that one a little bit.
I've talked about in previous podcasts, Steve, especially when it comes to Tren and the side effects, that some of our strength athletes I know are familiar with the use of Tren because it is a great strength drug. The problem is that strength athletes tend towards, they're leaner now than it used to be in the past, but they're still fatter than bodybuilders. There's still 10%, 15% body fat. Some you can start to see the abs, but for the most part, that's not the case. And yet it's a great strength drug. The problem is that being of a higher body fat and staying at a higher body fat, because we're talking about cutting here and pre-contest, is where the side effects come in and bite them on the ass, vis-a-vis the Tren sweats, the Trensomnias that we've already talked about. Whereas if you're leaner, that's less of an issue. On the anti-inflammatory thing, you just reminded me of something, Steve, and literally this, I've mentioned him before, the local former IFBB pro actually made a comment about it. He's been getting into shape. He wants to show his son how daddy used to look when he was on stage. He might do some posing, something like this. And he literally said that he'd dropped the excess cardio that he was doing, and mentioned the simple fact that because of the way that he was doing it to force the body fat down, it was having an inflammatory effect. And when he cut it down to the minimum that he needs right now, and he's starting to look in shape with the photographs, he says specifically that the water that he was retaining because of the inflammatory effect will drop off. I'm also reminded of pre-contest bodybuilders again, Steve, when they talk about not train legs super hard, not crazy squats, not crazy leg presses, a week or so out, and you'll see them laying backstage with their feet in the air to get the water out of the legs. And again, it's because a super hard bodybuilding, weightlifting, strength type workout in itself is anti-inflammatory. And of course, what you're looking to get here, guys, is in shape for a competition, which is inflammation will make you hold water, so you look fat when you're not. And we're looking to get into shape. Obviously, you're combining it with a diet. And bodybuilders, especially for a competition, tend to be, for obvious reasons, a great deal leaner than the strength athletes I mentioned earlier on. So it's incredibly important that your body fat is under control and you're working on it at diet, cardio, and equally that you're aware, as Steve says, of the inflammatory effects, both of the things that you're doing in the gym, potentially some foods that Steve's talked about before, and specifically with regards to the oral and or injectable Tren that Steve's mentioned just now. Those things, those nuances, Steve, that knowledge is the difference between second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on and so forth. Those kind of tweaks, that knowledge that bodybuilders that have done more than one competition, that have prepped someone, those are the things that you know, and those are the things that, unless you've got the experience of, you're not aware of. And these are the kind of pieces of information that help those guys get into shape and be on the podium ready to take a trophy. Back to you.
let's get into dosing, how to dose this a little bit. So this is something you're gonna have to play around with a little bit. So you might want to run this well ahead of your contest just to see how you react in terms of side effects. That's the issue on this one. It's going to be the side effects. That's going to be your main thing you got to watch out for. So, with Clenbuterol, I found that you start out with 40 to 60 micrograms a day. Then you gradually, every few days, you can up it by 20 micrograms. And then you get to a point, it's going to be maybe 100, 120 micrograms where you start getting those side effects that I mentioned earlier. The shaky hands, the overheating, maybe a little insomnia. I didn't have insomnia, but a lot of people do complain about insomnia too, which makes sense. Start getting those side effects, then you can stop upping it and then just keep that dose. And then if the side effects get worse and worse and worse, you lower the dose back down by 10 to 20 micrograms back down. And then you let it roll from there. So you got to feel those side effects when you're running Clen, because if you don't feel side effects, that means that it's not going to do what you want it to do. That's the kind of sucky thing about using Clen. So you can't run it just like at 40 micrograms, not feel any side effects, and think it's doing anything for you, because it's not. Now, how long should I run Clen? I've heard from people that the longer you run Clen, the better. But the thing is, the side effects, we're back to the side effect problem. Can you go through more than 2 weeks of these nasty side effects? Can you push 3 weeks? Can you push 4 weeks? It's not going to be realistic, especially when you're stacking oral Tren with it. So you really have to kind of just kind of play it by ear when it comes to this and experiment before you go into actual contest. This way, you know exactly what your game plan is. So 2 to 4 weeks at the most on it. And then the same thing with the oral Tren, 2 to 4 weeks at the most. And with the oral Trenbalone, really, it's amazing how low the dosages are. 250 to 500 micrograms a day. That's it. That's crazy. Compare it to something like Dianabol. What's the average dosage of Dianabol? 20 to 30 milligrams a day. This is half of a milligram a day. That's it.
Yeah.
So really, you're pushing it. After 3 weeks, you're pushing it. Remember, it's still going to mess up your liver, and so is the Clenbuterol. Any drug that you take is going to hit your liver to some extent, some more than others. And in these cases, they're going to hit all your organs, your heart, your kidneys, your liver, everything. Everything's going to get hit. So really, you got to be smart about taking it. So I would not push more than 100, 120 micrograms of Clen. I would not push more than 500 micrograms of the oral Tren per day. And I would not push more than 3 weeks. That's it. You're really going to feel it. If you want to go through, you're really going to feel it that third week. It's not going to be fun. It's not going to be. How many times have I heard people the first week, they do a stack like this and like, oh, I'm fine. I'm not feeling side effects. Then the second week, oh, they change their tune pretty quick. They change their tune. But the key is during this, you gotta keep working out. You got to keep working out, and you got to put in the cardio. Clen, like I said earlier, it changes the way your body burns body fat. So if you're not putting in the cardio while you're on Clen, you're wasting your time. And I understand that even if you sit on the couch watching TV, you still burn calories. I get it. You should still burn some body fat. But if you do the cardio, you really force your body to slam those fat cells and burn that body fat off for energy, because that's what the Clen is doing in your body. So Clenbuterol definitely changes the way your body burns up the fat. But if you're not putting in the time for the cardio, it's going to be excruciating to do the cardio on the stack. It's going to suck. If you hate cardio before, you're going to really hate it on the stack. But you got to do it. Just make sure you hydrate. And that's going to be one of the tips that I give you guys for that. I'm going to give you some tips on hydration for the end of this podcast.
Yeah, so quick tips here, guys. Number one, Steve's already covered one, which is if you want to get the best results in the cycle, do more work. And as uncomfortable as that's going to be, do your cardio, diet on point. Like Steve says, maybe you're going to burn fat sitting there on the sofa watching the TV, but how much better are your results going to be? So that's number one. Number two, Steve, and this is one of those tips again. I did this for my very first cycle ever because I was literally thinking, how do I deal with steroids? Am I going to be good? Am I going to be bad? Am I going to be anxious? Whatever. And so what I would say with both of these drugs, because of the side effects they can have for some users, run them for a short period of time, way before you do any contest prep, just to see how you get on with them, just to see how you deal with them and the side effects and how you manage the anxiety if you have it. And literally you've practiced and you've got an idea of what works and what doesn't work. And then when you go into the show and you're actually doing the show and contest prep, you know how they're going to affect you. You know about the inflammatory effects and so on and so forth. And something else, I know Steve's going to touch on this as well, because you just mentioned hydration, but you need an organ protector on this cycle. So we highly recommend N2 Guard. You need something like this. Again, the sense and feeling of these two drugs working, way Steve described a few minutes ago, that actual sense of it doing its magic above a certain level, that at the same time is putting stress on your system, and you need something like N2 Guard to protect that. Now back to you, Steve, for a couple of tips before we finish.
So let's talk about hydration. Hydration is very important. The first thing you need to do in the morning when you wake up on the stack is drink a lot of water.
Yeah.
All right. You need to drink good quality water too. I can't stress enough, how bad the water is out there. Bottled water is a scam. Most bottled water out there is a scam. It's just tap water. So basically they just take tap water, put it in a bottle and sell it. It's really pathetic. It's literally the same tap water you get out of your tap. So you want to make sure you get good brands of tap water. There's websites that are out there that tell you Fiji is a good brand, 365 is a good brand, Zephyrhills is a good brand. These are good spring waters that actually come from springs, but other water products out there, the big brands, are really, really bad. So it's not going to help you. So you want to make sure you get a lot of hydration. Before bed, a lot of hydration. When you wake up in the middle of the night to pee, a lot of hydration. All right. You're going to pee a lot on this stack. Take a bottle with you. Keep a bottle in your car and piss in it. If you're on the road, that's what you do. I mean, I do it, so a lot of people don't like to use public bathrooms anymore, especially since the pandemic. I've never liked to use public bathrooms. So I rather just pee on a tree or something than walk into a public bathroom. But, that's what's going to happen on the stack. And look, you want to basically the side effects, you want to monitor your side effects. And I talked about this earlier. If your side effects get bad, you need to drop the dose. You need to listen to your body. Don't do anything stupid on this stack. Like, don't do anything stupid to make yourself sick. Don't eat out at some new Chinese restaurant in town that you've never eaten at before. Because if you get food poisoning on this stack, you can die. You can kill yourself on this stack. I went deep sea fishing one time. I was on a harsh trend stack, and I was throwing up for like 6 hours straight. And my pee was literally like brown. That's how dehydrated I got. And I could have killed myself. Came really close to killing myself. But don't do anything stupid on this stack. Don't travel on this stack. Don't get on an airplane, get air sick and have to throw up, So if you get dehydrated, if something happens, you get dehydrated, you need to hydrate. Get some electrolytes and rehydrate yourself, because that's what you're going to have to do. All right. So.
Yeah. So 100% agree with Steve. I've mentioned this in many podcasts, and I think it's super important again. Cardio on point, diet on point. You'll be training really hard, so watch the inflammatory effects of that. Manage your anxieties, I've mentioned earlier on, but the hydration thing that Steve touched upon is 100% something I agree with here. It's going to help filter your system. It's going to help get rid of contaminants and broken up tissue and whatever the else you're excreting. It's the only thing I would probably look at here, Steve, when we're talking about electrolytes, potentially both in any fluid that you're taking in, and sometimes you're going to manipulate those electrolytes, especially towards the end. I mean, literally the last few days. So keep that on point, guys. You need to be 100% careful with that stuff. Do you know what, Steve? I'd also want to be real careful. And again, make sure you work with a coach on this for diuretics, because you're already messing around. Something that Steve and I talked about in the pre-show that I do now, and maybe it's just because I'm an older guy, maybe it's because my bed's super warm at the night time, but I keep probably about a litre and a half by my bedside of some dilute squash. And as I said to Steve in the pre-show, it's very easy for me to drink half of that before I go to sleep, and at least another half if I wake up through the night, like Steve said. And I still get a little bit of coloration in my pee because of the vitamins and supplements that I'm taking. So yeah, these are the sort of things we're talking about. The little details that we mentioned earlier on, guys, the sort of stuff that you find and learn when you're doing contest prep. These are super important. And what you're doing here is getting in shape. So like I said, do the work to optimize what results that you get from these two performance enhancing drugs. Make sure that you're using a product into God to protect you. Make sure you stay hydrated. That's kind of it. Otherwise, hit Steve up for a consult. Get yourself on the forums, double check the information that we've talked about. Come on, ask us questions and let us know what you think. As always, please note, we are not doctors and the opinions on these shows are ours and ours alone. It's our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.